I never believed in ghosts. Growing up, my sister loved to spook me with stories of haunted houses and cursed forests, but I always shrugged them off as silly fairy tales. That was until I spent the night at the Whitmore Estate, a crumbling Victorian mansion on the edge of town with a dark reputation. I had no intention of staying there. I'm not one of those thrill seekers who chases paranormal legends. My visit was entirely accidental. I was driving back from a late-night meeting, and my car broke down on the winding country road just a few miles from town. My phone had no signal, and the Whitmore Estate was the only building within sight. I remember hesitating as I stared at the looming structure through the drizzle. The house was massive, its spires and gables silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. Every window seemed like a black, unblinking eye. The thought of stepping inside made my stomach churn, but the cold was biting, and the rain was getting heavier. I had no choice. The front gate creaked loudly as I pushed it open. It sounded like a scream in the still night, and I froze, expecting something to appear. But the grounds were silent, save for the rustling of dead leaves in the wind. I hurried up the overgrown path, my shoes squelching in the mud. The front door was unlocked, which should have been my first warning. It swung open with a groan, revealing a cavernous foyer bathed in shadows. A grand staircase twisted upward, its banister coated in years of dust. Faded portraits lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to follow me as I stepped inside. "Hello!" I called out, my voice echoing eerily. There was no answer. The air inside the Whitmore Estate was stale, tinged with a faint metallic scent I couldn't place. I closed the door behind me, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. My footsteps echoed across the marble floor as I moved cautiously toward the staircase. "Anyone here?" I tried again, louder this time. My voice felt small in the vastness of the mansion. I spotted a faint flicker of light down a corridor to my left. It wasn't steady like a bulb, but danced like the flame of a candle. Relief washed over me. Someone must be here. Maybe a caretaker? Or some eccentric who had taken up residence in the old mansion. Either way, I wasn't alone. As I moved toward the light, the silence of the house felt oppressive. My ears strained to catch any sound, creaking floorboards, a cough, anything. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. The corridor was lined with more portraits, but these were different from the ones in the foyer. The subjects were all turned slightly to the side, as though looking over their shoulders. Their faces were half in shadow, and their expressions were wrong, twisted, almost like they were sneering. I quickened my pace, trying not to look too closely. The flickering light led me to a room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, and I could see the faint glow of a candle inside. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, but I ignored them and pushed the door open. The room was a library, its walls lined with bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. A single candle sat on a desk in the center of the room, its flame casting long, dancing shadows. But the room was empty. "Hello!" I called out again, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. I walked over to the desk, glancing around nervously. The candle was fresh, its wax barely melted. Someone had been here recently. But where were they now? A loud bang shattered the silence, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It came from the hallway behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The door I had just walked through was now closed. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Hello? Is someone there? This isn't funny." The door creaked open slowly, inch by inch, as though someone, or something, was on the other side. The hallway beyond was pitch black. I grabbed the candle from the desk, clutching it like a lifeline, and stepped toward the door. My hands trembled, the flame flickering dangerously as I leaned into the corridor. The portraits were different. Their faces, once twisted in shadow, were now fully visible, and they were looking directly at me. Their expressions were horrified, mouths agape as if screaming. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward into the library. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer. I spun around, holding the candle up. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. The room was empty. The candle flickered wildly, its light shrinking until it was barely more than a glow. My shadow stretched across the walls, growing longer and darker until it seemed to take on a life of its own. And then it moved. Not me, my shadow. It twisted and writhed, detaching itself from my movements. I dropped the candle in panic, plunging the room into darkness. I bolted for the door, slamming it behind me and running blindly down the hallway. My footsteps echoed, but I could hear others behind me, faster, heavier, and gaining. When I reached the staircase, I made the mistake of looking back. A figure stood at the end of the corridor, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadow. But its eyes, they glowed faintly like embers. The figure raised a hand, and the door at the far end of the hall slammed shut with a deafening crash. I turned and sprinted down the stairs, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. The foyer was darker than before, the shadows seeming to press in around me. I fumbled with the front door, but it wouldn't budge. "Please let me out," I shouted, pounding on the wood. Behind me, I heard the sound of whispering, low and guttural, like 100 voices speaking at once. It grew louder, filling the room, until I could feel it vibrating in my chest. And then silence. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run. The figure was there, standing at the foot of the staircase. It was closer now, its features clearer in the dim light. Its face was impossibly pale, with deep, sunken eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide. It pointed at me, and the whispering returned, louder and more urgent. The walls of the foyer seemed to close in, the air growing thick and suffocating. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of a rug and falling hard onto the marble floor. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was the figure looming over me, its glowing eyes burning into mine. When I woke, I was lying on the cold, hard floor of the Whitmore Estates foyer. My head throbbed, and the air still carried that faint metallic scent. For a moment, I thought I'd escaped the nightmare, that maybe it had all been some bizarre hallucination. But then I noticed the silence. The house was deathly quiet, oppressive and heavy, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Slowly, I pushed myself to my feet. The front door was directly in front of me, slightly ajar now. It was almost inviting. Cautiously, I stepped forward, my legs weak and unsteady. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to get out while I could, to leave this cursed place behind and never look back. The door loomed closer, the outside world just a few steps away, and then I heard it. A soft, wet drip. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the foyer. I froze, my gaze drawn upward, and my stomach turned as I saw it. The chandelier above me was dripping something dark and viscous. Blood. Thick rivulets of it ran down the chains and splattered onto the marble floor. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped back, horrified. Then came the laughter. Low at first, like a distant chuckle, but it quickly grew, twisting into a maniacal cackle that filled the entire house. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My ears rang with it, my vision blurring as panic set in. I turned back to the door, determined to escape, but it slammed shut with a force that shook the ground beneath me. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Behind me, the whispers started again, rising from the darkness. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, their guttural tones filled with malice. I turned slowly, my back pressed against the door. The figure was there. Only now it wasn't alone. Dozens of them stood in the shadows, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. They watched me, unmoving, their faces blank and emotionless. The whispers grew louder, filling my head until it felt like my skull would split. "Why?" I managed to croak, my voice barely audible. "What do you want?" The lead figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. It spoke a single word. "Stay." The walls around me began to shift, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal pulsating veins beneath. The house was alive, its very structure twisted and malevolent. The floor beneath me cracked, revealing a chasm of writhing shadows that seemed to reach for me. I screamed, clawing at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figures moved closer, their outstretched hands cold and clammy as they grabbed at me, pulling me toward the darkness. I fought with everything I had, but it was useless. The shadows consumed me, dragging me into the depths of the house. My screams echoed in the void, merging with the laughter and whispers until I couldn't tell where my voice ended and theirs began. And then silence. I don't know how much time has passed since that night. Days? Weeks? Years? Time has no meaning here. I'm part of the house now, just another shadow in its endless halls. Sometimes I see others, lost souls who wander in, just as I did. They call out, their voices trembling with fear. I want to warn them, to tell them to run, but I can't. The house won't let me. So I watch as they're drawn deeper into its embrace, their fates sealed the moment they step through the door. And I wonder, will anyone ever escape? Or are we all destined to become part of the shadows? The Whitmore estate waits, always hungry, always watching. And it knows you're out there, waiting for your turn.